A millionaire CEO thought he'd lost everything when a major deal collapsed, until two little girls appeared outside his office and told him who really took the documents, and who he was to them. Alexander Reed had always been a man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room. With his sharp suits, perfectly styled hair, and voice honed by years of boardroom battles, he was known not only for his wealth, but for his absolute control. He built his empire brick by brick, making decisions with cold precision and never looking back. On the morning of what was meant to be the biggest deal of his career, he stood at the head of a gleaming glass conference room, ready to sign a contract that would seal a long-awaited merger with a powerful international conglomerate. His team was prepared. The documents had been reviewed a dozen times. Everything was timed to the second. This deal was supposed to cement his legacy. As the foreign executives filed in, nodding politely, Alexander offered his usual confident handshake, masking the storm of adrenaline that always came just before closing. He sat at the center of the table, gesturing to his assistant to begin distributing the final documents. The room buzzed with low murmurs of anticipation, until it didn't. The assistant paused mid-step, face suddenly pale. The portfolio in her hands was incomplete. She rifled through it again, then whispered to him with urgency. The original signed agreements, the documents required to finalize the transaction, were gone. Gone. Alexander's smile faltered. His posture stiffened. The room began to shift, energy thinning as the clients exchanged puzzled looks. He asked to pause the meeting, dismissing himself for a moment, his jaw tight. Behind the closed doors of the adjacent office, he demanded an immediate search. Files, briefcases, scanned servers, security footage. No one had touched the originals since the night before. No one had authorization to move them. And yet, they were simply missing. With no documents, there could be no signature. With no signature, there could be no deal. 15 minutes later, the executives left the building, disappointed and silent. The merger fell apart in a single morning. The whispers began almost immediately. The press would report a logistical error. His rivals would enjoy the spectacle. But within his own company, among his own people, the laughter was sharper. Quiet but unmistakable. The mighty Alexander Reed, brought down not by scandal or market crash, but by a misplaced folder. He stood alone in the hallway afterward, staring out the window at the skyline he once believed he ruled. His reflection in the glass looked the same, flawless suit, impeccable posture, but something inside him had cracked. He could rebuild, of course. He always had. But this time, the failure wasn't just a stumble. It felt personal, targeted. Deliberate. He didn't know it yet, but the truth behind that morning's disaster wouldn't come from a security report or corporate spy. It would come from two strangers, small, determined, and watching him from the street with wide green eyes and matching backpacks. Alexander didn't notice the girls right away. His mind was still spinning, locked in the chaos of what had just happened. He had spent the past hour pacing between meetings, berating his assistant, checking surveillance footage, and demanding answers from a dozen people who had none. Everything about the morning felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. And then he stepped out of the office building, needing a break from the cold artificial air, and walked into the sunlight. That's when he saw them. Two little girls stood by the edge of the fountain near the building's entrance. They were maybe 6 years old, identical in every way, same blonde braids, same pale green eyes, same backpacks with pink unicorns embroidered on the front. They weren't playing or talking. They were just watching him. It was unsettling, not in a threatening way, but in a strange, piercing sort of silence, like they knew something he didn't. He tried to ignore it at first, walked a few steps past them, then stopped. He turned and glanced back. They were still watching. The bolder of the two stepped forward. "Are you Mr. Reed?" she asked, her voice clear and direct. Alexander blinked. He was not used to being addressed by children, especially not like this. "Yes," he said cautiously. The second girl moved next to her sister and nodded as if confirming something. Then the first one said it. "We know who took your papers." He stared at them, unsure whether to laugh or question their parents. "Excuse me?" The man with the gray coat, the first girl continued. "We saw him late last night. He took a folder from your office." Alexander narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about? How would you know that?" "We followed him," the second girl said, as calmly as if she were talking about a game. "We knew he was doing something wrong." "Followed him," he repeated, still trying to grasp what was happening. "We've been watching for a while," the first girl said. "We were waiting for the right time." He crouched slightly so he could look them in the eye. "Why would you be watching me?" he asked, no longer skeptical, just confused. They hesitated for a moment. Then one of them, he still couldn't tell which, spoke with surprising seriousness. "Because you're our dad." Time stopped. His mind went blank. He stared at them, trying to make sense of the words. Surely he had misheard. But they stood there without flinching, identical faces staring back at him with such quiet certainty that he couldn't breathe for a moment. What did you say?" he asked, his voice catching. "You're our dad," one of them repeated. "Our mom's name is Leah. You knew her a long time ago." The name hit him like a memory he hadn't meant to remember. Leah. Of course he remembered her, soft voice, clever smile, the way she used to call him out when no one else dared. They had shared something real once. It ended when he left for Europe to expand the company. He never looked back. He had no idea she was pregnant. His mouth went dry. His thoughts were racing. Does your mom know you're here?" They nodded. "She said we could tell you if we were sure." "And you're sure?" They looked at each other, then back at him. "We've been sure since the day we saw you on TV." Alexander straightened slowly, the weight of everything pressing down on him at once. The lost deal, the betrayal, the documents, and now this. Two girls claiming to be his daughters, delivering information no one else could, and somehow knowing exactly who he was. They had followed him. They had watched him. They had waited. Not to accuse, not to ask for anything, but to help him. To reveal the truth. And in doing so, they had shaken the very foundation of the life he thought he controlled. Alexander sat in his office with the door shut, the blinds drawn, and his phone on silent. It was the first time in years he had willingly missed a meeting. He stared at the name on the screen of his laptop, Leah Morgan. It had been 6 years since he had spoken to her. Even longer since they had last seen each other. Her name looked unfamiliar now, and yet seeing it made his chest tighten with something he didn't want to name. The girls hadn't lied. That was the most unsettling part. Everything they said had checked out. He had called in a private security team after their conversation by the fountain. Within hours, they confirmed it. His longtime assistant, Paul Gaines, had been caught on internal surveillance footage entering Alexander's private office late at night, using a second key card that no one knew existed. The footage was partial, the angle poor, but it was enough. Paul had taken a folder from the drawer where the merger documents were kept. He had signed out that same night under a different name on the security sheet. Days later, he abruptly resigned and vanished. Alexander didn't feel triumph. He felt exposed. Betrayed. The sabotage had nearly cost him everything, but the worst part was how easily it had slipped through his fingers without him noticing. That, and the fact that 2 children, not his security team, not his advisors, had solved it. Children who had called him their father. He replayed the conversation over and over in his head. Their identical faces. The way they had stood so still, so serious. Their voices had no trace of manipulation, no desperation. Just truth. Simple, direct, and heavier than anything he'd ever signed. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He hadn't spoken to Leah since their relationship ended. When he'd left the country to expand the company's European branch, they had already been drifting. She'd said she needed more from him, and he, consumed by ambition, had said nothing in return. They hadn't even had a proper goodbye. He'd boarded the plane with no idea that she would go on with her life and raise 2 daughters, his daughters, on her own. He thought about calling. About demanding answers. But something stopped him. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the memory of her voice. Or maybe it was the realization that she had no obligation to explain anything anymore. So instead, he searched. Within a few minutes, he found her. A nurse at a small family clinic just outside the city. Still in the area. Still close enough that he could have known, should have known. Her staff photo on the clinic website was a smaller, softer version of the woman he remembered. Her smile looked tired but sincere. There was no mention of a husband, no wedding ring in the photo. Nothing that told him what kind of life she had built, only that she had done it without him. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The idea of fatherhood had always been abstract to him. Something for other men with time to waste or with families they'd carefully built alongside their careers. Not him. He had always convinced himself there would be time later, after the next deal, after the company went public, after he'd finally reached that imaginary pinnacle. And now here he was, with 2 daughters who already had names, stories, and memories that didn't include him. He couldn't change that. But he could show up now. By the afternoon, he was standing outside the clinic, unsure what he was doing. He wasn't used to doubt. He wasn't used to fear. But as he stood there, watching people come and go, the weight of everything he had missed came crashing down on him. He didn't bring flowers. He didn't wear a suit. Just jeans, a sweater, and the truth. He walked in, gave his name at the front desk, and waited in the corner like any other man who just realized his life wasn't what he thought it was. When Leah finally appeared at the door, their eyes met. Her expression didn't change. Not shock, not warmth. Just silence. "I think we need to talk," he said quietly. She nodded once. And that was how it began. Not with apologies. Not with anger. Just a single nod. And 2 people who had once loved and lost, now standing on the edge of something they couldn't yet define. Leah led him into a small consultation room at the back of the clinic. The walls were pale blue, a calming color, but nothing in Alexander's chest felt calm. She closed the door behind them and didn't offer him a seat. He didn't expect one. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She stood across from him, arms folded, back straight, chin high. She looked older, but not in the way that time wears a person down, more like someone who had carried the weight of many years and refused to be bent by them. Her eyes, a rich hazel he remembered too well, held a steady fire. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again," she said at last, her voice even, giving nothing away. "I didn't know I had any reason to," he replied, and then immediately regretted how that sounded. "I mean, I didn't know about them. About the girls. Leah, if I had." "You would have what?" she interrupted, not harshly, but with clear disbelief. "You would have come back? Dropped everything? You left without a word, Alex." "I sent emails. I left messages. I even came by your office once. Your assistant told me you were in London for the quarter, and that you weren't accepting personal visits." He felt the sting of her words, sharp and deserved. He remembered those years, fast, relentless, everything a blur of airports and boardrooms. He remembered turning off his personal phone entirely to focus. He hadn't wanted to be distracted. And in doing so, he'd missed the one thing that should have mattered most. "I didn't know," he said again, softer this time. "I had no idea you were pregnant. That you were trying to reach me." Leah studied him for a long moment. "I didn't want anything from you," she said. "When I stopped trying, it wasn't out of anger. I just realized I couldn't chase a ghost forever. So I raised them. I did what I had to do. And they've been more than enough." He nodded slowly, humbled in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. "They're incredible," he said. "Smart. Brave. And apparently better investigators than my entire security team." Something flickered at the corner of her mouth, almost like amusement. But it passed quickly. "They watched you for months," she said. "They saw your photo online, recognized your name. I answered their questions as simply as I could. They asked if they could meet you. I told them they could, if they were ready. And they were," he murmured, still stunned by it. "They're not like other kids," Leah said, softer now. "They see things. They remember everything. When they found out what happened to your deal, they wanted to help. I didn't stop them, but I didn't encourage it either. I wasn't sure if you deserved to be found." That landed harder than he expected. But he didn't argue. She had every right to say it. "I know I don't deserve to ask for anything," he said quietly. "But I want to. I want to be in their lives. Not just as the man they helped once. I want to know them. I want them to know me. Even if it's just piece by piece." Leah sat down then, finally. She looked tired, not physically, but emotionally, the way someone looks after carrying the same question for years. "I won't let them be hurt," she said. "Not by you. Not by your schedule, or your career, or your guilt." "I won't hurt them," Alexander said, without hesitation. "You have my word." She looked at him for a long while, and the silence between them shifted. It wasn't cold anymore. Just heavy with things unsaid. "You can take them to the park tomorrow," she said eventually. "If they still want to go." He nodded, barely daring to breathe. "I'll be there." "I know," she said, standing up. "That's what scares me." As he left the clinic, the autumn air felt sharper than before. But it was the kind of sharpness that woke something inside him. Not fear. Not shame. Hope. Raw, unsteady, but real. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the park 15 minutes early. It was a crisp, clear day, and the sky stretched wide and pale above the trees, their leaves already tinged with the colors of early fall. The sun was low, casting a soft golden hue across the benches, the walking path, and the playground with its bright swings and slides. He had brought nothing with him, no briefcase, no tablet, no business phone. Only himself, and a sense of anticipation that pulsed just beneath his skin. He hadn't felt like this since his first major investment pitch, but this time, the stakes were far more personal. He sat on the same bench near the sandbox, tapping his fingers on his knee to ease the nervous energy. Part of him still couldn't believe any of this was real. That two 6-year-old girls had not only cracked the truth behind his biggest professional disaster but had also revealed themselves to be his daughters. That Leah, despite her pain and justified anger, had agreed to give him a chance. It didn't feel like forgiveness. Not yet. But it felt like a door opening. He looked up when he heard laughter. There they were, coming down the path hand in hand, their identical blonde ponytails bouncing as they skipped beside Leah. Both girls wore matching jackets with patches of stars sewn onto the sleeves. When they saw him, they let go of their mother's hands and ran ahead, their steps light and unafraid. "Hi, Mr. Reed," one of them called out, grinning. "Henrietta," the other whispered dramatically, elbowing her sister. "We said we'd call him Dad today." "Oh right," the first said, then turned back to him and repeated it more seriously. "Hi, Dad." Alexander felt something shift in his chest. He stood slowly, unsure whether to kneel, hug them, or speak, but both girls solved it for him by running up and wrapping their arms around his waist. It was awkward and perfect. He crouched down to their level, meeting two sets of green eyes that blinked back at him with unfiltered joy. "I'm really glad to see you," he said softly. "Both of you." They nodded in unison, clearly pleased with themselves. Leah approached more slowly, her arms crossed over her chest, but she didn't look guarded. Just cautious. Protective. "We brought coloring books," one of the girls announced. "We thought you might be bad at coloring and we want to test you." "I accept the challenge," Alexander replied with a smile. They settled in on the grass beneath a tree, the girls spreading out their supplies with the precision of experienced artists. Alexander sat cross-legged between them, awkward at first, then more relaxed as the minutes passed. He colored a lopsided unicorn and got laughed at for choosing the wrong color for the horn. One of them insisted on braiding a tiny section of his hair with a purple ribbon. He let her. When he made up a story about a magical detective turtle, they giggled so hard they fell onto each other. Leah sat nearby on a bench, reading a book but not really watching. Not because she didn't care, because she was giving them space. Trusting them. Trusting him. Later, as the sun shifted and the shadows grew longer, the girls asked if he could walk them home. He looked to Leah for permission. She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Their apartment was small but filled with life, hand-drawn pictures taped to the fridge, a worn sofa with a knitted blanket, tiny shoes scattered by the door. Alexander helped the girls take off their jackets, and one of them pointed proudly at a picture taped to the wall. "That's our family," she said. "We drew it yesterday." He stepped closer. 3 figures, 2 little girls holding the hands of a taller man with brown hair. In the corner, a smiling woman sat on a cloud with a cat. He swallowed hard and turned to them. "Is that me?" he asked. They nodded again. "I don't wear purple suits," he said gently. "You do now," they replied. Leah stepped into the room behind him, arms still crossed, but there was a warmth in her eyes now. Not complete acceptance, not certainty. But something real. They shared dinner, something simple, soup and toast, filled with laughter and crumbs and spilled juice. After the girls were tucked into bed, Alexander helped clean up the dishes. Leah didn't stop him. At the door, before he left, she looked at him without the wall she had always worn around her. "They trust you," she said. "I won't let them down." "I know." And for the first time, she didn't say it like a warning. She said it like hope. The following weeks unfolded like pages in a story Alexander never expected to live. Each day brought something small, something ordinary, and yet each moment felt extraordinary. He began to understand what it meant to truly show up, not just to make appearances, but to be present, consistent, and real. The girls, Ava and Chloe, never demanded anything from him. They didn't ask where he'd been or why he was only now appearing in their lives. Instead, they simply accepted him. They let him in like they'd been waiting, not with conditions, but with the pure, instinctive trust only children can offer when they believe someone means well. He took them to school some mornings and picked them up in the afternoons when Leah had long shifts at the clinic. He learned their favorite after-school snacks, strawberry yogurt for Ava, apple slices with cinnamon for Chloe, and the exact way they liked their sandwiches cut. He helped with spelling lists, stood on the sidelines at their soccer practice even though they both spent more time chasing butterflies than the ball, and watched every chaotic drawing they brought home become a treasure. Every minute felt like catching up on years he had lost, and though he could never get those years back, he tried to build something worthy of the time they had now. Leah watched all of this from the edges at first, letting him find his way without interference. She was protective, of course, but not cold. Sometimes, Alexander caught her smiling when she thought he wasn't looking, at how he crouched down to tie a shoelace, or how he made a terrible joke at dinner just to hear the girls laugh. She didn't open up easily, and he didn't push. But the air between them had changed. The silence they once shared had been stiff, filled with things unspoken. Now, it felt like space, room to breathe, to observe, to slowly rebuild what had once been fractured. One evening, during a rare lull in the noise, he found Leah on the balcony just outside the apartment's small living room. She was sipping tea, wrapped in a cardigan, her eyes fixed on the skyline. He stepped outside without a word and stood beside her, both of them wrapped in a quiet that felt natural. "They talk about you all the time," she said after a while. "At school. At bedtime. It's always, 'Dad said this' or 'Dad did that.' Like you've always been here." He looked at her, surprised, humbled. "I still can't believe they call me that so easily." "They don't know how not to," she replied. "Kids don't measure time the way we do. They just feel who's there. And who isn't." He nodded, processing the weight of that truth. "I want to be here. For good. Whatever that looks like." Leah's expression shifted. There was something unreadable in her eyes, worry, maybe, or fear of saying the wrong thing. "You have a life outside of this. A big one. I don't want to wake up 6 months from now and see you disappear again because some deal needs you in another country." "I walked away from that life," he said. "I didn't lose it, I let it go. I used to think the world revolved around the company. But that was just an excuse to keep from having to face things I was afraid of. I don't want to build empires anymore. I want to build something real." She looked at him, long and searching, and for a moment, he thought she might turn away. But then she said quietly, "I don't know if I can trust that yet. But I want to." That was more than he expected, and everything he needed. A few days later, Ava came down with a fever. It started as something small, just a tired look, a few skipped bites of dinner, but by nightfall, her temperature had climbed dangerously high. Leah called him in a panic, her voice tight with worry, asking him to meet them at the urgent care center. When he arrived, he found her holding Ava close in the waiting room, whispering reassurances even as her own hands shook. Chloe sat beside them, clinging to Leah's arm, quiet and wide-eyed. Alexander crossed the room without hesitation, crouched down, and placed a steady hand on Leah's shoulder. "I'm here," he said. "Whatever you need." When the nurse called Ava's name, he carried her inside. She whimpered against his chest but didn't resist. Leah followed close behind, clutching Chloe's hand. The hours passed slowly, heavy with waiting and the sterile brightness of clinic lights. Ava was diagnosed with a virus that would pass in time, but the fear had been real. In those tense, exhausting hours, Alexander stayed. He held Ava's hand through the blood draw, read aloud from a wrinkled children's book they found in the waiting room, and helped Leah settle her into bed once they were finally home. Later that night, as Leah tucked Chloe in and checked on Ava for the 5th time, she found Alexander still in the girls' room, sitting on the floor with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, just in case they needed him. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him in the soft glow of the nightlight. "You didn't have to stay," she said quietly. "I know," he whispered. "But I wanted to." She didn't respond. She just crossed the room and sat beside him. And together, in that quiet, safe space between two sleeping daughters, something wordless passed between them, trust beginning to take root, not in grand gestures, but in the soft, unshakable presence of a man who, at last, chose to stay. Autumn deepened around them, filling the city with golden light, rustling leaves, and a sense of quiet transition that seemed to mirror what was happening in Alexander's life. His days were no longer dictated by meetings and stock reports but by school drop-offs, dance rehearsals, and early morning cereal spills. The change wasn't immediate or dramatic, but it was lasting. He didn't just rearrange his schedule, he rewrote it entirely. The people around him noticed. Some were confused. Others were skeptical. But Alexander didn't owe them explanations anymore. The only voices that truly mattered now were the ones calling him Dad when he walked through the front door. Leah, too, began to shift, slowly, carefully. The walls she had so carefully built didn't crumble, but they softened. She let him help with more than just the girls: grocery shopping, cleaning out the cluttered hall closet, assembling the furniture they'd been putting off for months. He never forced his way in. He just showed up and stayed. Some evenings they cooked together, usually simple meals filled with mistakes and laughter. He burnt the garlic, she oversalted the soup, and yet, somehow, it was the best food either of them had tasted in years. They began to talk more about the past. Not in long, emotional conversations, but in fragments, moments stitched into the evenings when the girls were asleep and the apartment was finally quiet. Leah told him how scared she'd been when she found out she was pregnant, how alone she had felt walking into the hospital without a hand to hold. He listened, not trying to defend himself, not trying to explain. Just listening, letting the words sit in the air between them like the truth they had both carried for too long. One night, after the girls had gone to bed and the dishes had been washed and stacked, Leah brought out a small photo album. It was worn at the edges, the cover faded. She didn't say anything as she placed it on the table between them. Alexander looked at her, then opened it. The first page was a sonogram photo. His throat tightened. The next few pages were filled with baby pictures, two identical infants with button noses and big, curious eyes. There were birthdays he hadn't attended, first steps he hadn't seen, preschool drawings he hadn't hung on his fridge. He turned each page slowly, as if touching something sacred. "I used to imagine what you'd say if you saw them," Leah said softly, her voice low. "Every milestone, every time they asked why they didn't have a dad, I'd wonder what you'd do if you walked through that door." "I would have come if I'd known," he said, almost to himself. "I believe you," she replied. "Now I do." He looked up at her then, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that had been missing since the moment they reconnected: ease, not just with him, but with the idea of letting herself feel something again. Days later, they took the girls to a fall festival outside the city. There were hayrides and pumpkin carving stations, face painting, and cider stands. Ava and Chloe wore matching scarves and insisted on riding the Ferris wheel twice. Alexander won a stuffed bear at a ring toss booth and gave it to Leah without a word. She laughed and called it ugly, but she kept it anyway. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep in the back seat on the drive home, he glanced over at her. She was quiet, her hand resting lightly on the armrest between them. "I've been thinking," he said. "Not about moving too fast. Just about what it means to move forward." Leah turned to him, her face lit by passing streetlights. "I think," she said, "we already are." And that was enough. Not a promise. Not a plan. But a beginning. One built on what they had both learned the hard way, that love, real love, isn't loud or perfect. It's showing up. It's staying. It's trying again, even after everything. And this time, neither of them planned on letting go. The first snow arrived early that year. It fell quietly during the night, covering the city in a soft, white hush that made everything feel slower, gentler, and almost unreal. When Alexander opened the curtains the next morning in the apartment where he now spent most of his time, he stood for a long while in silence, watching the flakes swirl down in lazy spirals. The world looked new, like someone had taken all the noise and dust and simply erased it. He smiled to himself, then turned when he heard little footsteps pounding down the hallway. Ava and Chloe burst into the room in their pajamas, already arguing over whose boots were cooler and how soon they could go outside to make snow angels. Their excitement filled the space so completely that it pushed away the last of the quiet. Alexander pretended to weigh their arguments carefully before declaring both pairs of boots equally magical, which seemed to satisfy them. Leah appeared soon after, sleep still in her eyes, a robe wrapped around her as she carried 2 steaming mugs of cocoa for the girls and coffee for herself. She handed Alexander his without a word and leaned against the wall with a small, sleepy smile. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture. But in that ordinary moment, cocoa, snow, shared glances, there was peace. The rest of the day unfolded like a scene from a life Alexander had never believed he could have. They built snowmen in the park, the kind with lopsided carrot noses and scarves that kept falling off. He pulled the girls on a sled until his legs gave out and he collapsed in the snow, laughing so hard he couldn't breathe. Leah took pictures, shaking her head, her gloves dusted with snow, and when the sun began to set and their cheeks were flushed pink, they all walked home hand in hand, the girls in the middle, swinging between them. That night, the girls begged for a story, but not one from a book. "Tell us about when you met Mommy," Ava said, already snuggling into her pillow. Chloe chimed in, "Yeah, tell us if you knew she was gonna be our mom." Leah raised an eyebrow from the doorway, amused but curious herself. So Alexander told them the story, how he'd met Leah at a charity fundraiser years ago, how she had corrected his statistics during a speech and completely embarrassed him, and how that was the moment he knew he wanted to talk to her again. He left out the parts that weren't meant for them yet, the harder chapters. But the story ended the way it needed to, with him admitting that walking away had been the worst mistake of his life, and that finding them, Leah, Ava, Chloe, was the best thing that ever happened to him. After the girls fell asleep, he and Leah sat quietly in the living room, the lights low, the snow still falling outside the window. She was curled up on the couch, legs tucked under her, and he sat beside her, unsure if it was the right time to speak what had been growing in his chest for weeks. "I know we haven't said anything out loud," he began, "not really. But this, it's more than I ever hoped for." Leah didn't move, but she looked at him with a softness that had taken months to return. "You don't have to say it yet," she said gently. "But if you feel it, show it. Keep showing up. Keep being who you've been these past few months." "I will," he said. "I promise." She reached over and took his hand, not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet confirmation. He squeezed it back, and they sat that way, listening to the silence, knowing the girls were safe and warm just down the hall. Weeks later, on New Year's Eve, Alexander officially moved into a home just a few blocks away, a small house with a porch where he imagined the girls waiting for the school bus and a kitchen where he and Leah could make burnt pancakes on lazy Sundays. They didn't rush anything, didn't push. They just kept showing up. Day after day. Choice after choice. And somewhere in the quiet rhythms of a new life, something remarkable had happened. They had become a family. Not by accident, not because it was easy, but because they fought for it, with honesty, patience, and the courage to try again. And this time, it wasn't too late. It was just the beginning. There's no magic in this story, only honesty, mistakes, and people finding their way back to each other. And that's exactly where its strength lies. The ending doesn't promise a perfect life or paint a fairy tale, but it gives us something more important: hope. Alexander didn't become a different man overnight, and Leah didn't forgive him instantly. But they did something truly difficult: they stayed, they learned to trust, and they chose to be a family not out of obligation, but out of desire. This is a story about second chances, not given by luck, but earned through courage, patience, and presence. And perhaps that's the truest form of love there is.